I think, had faced the banks being closed, and then we would probably have general panic and maybe riots on our hands.
Fellow Icelanders, I have requested the opportunity to address you at this time when the Icelandic nation faces major difficulties. The entire world is experiencing a major economic crisis, which can be likened in its effects on the world's banking systems to an economic natural disaster.
Well, I was in the parliament, and I heard it in the parliament, and obviously it was quite a dramatic moment, and I think everybody realized that the events that we were experiencing were sort of historic events, and that we really didn't know what they would lead to.
May God save Iceland.
Back in London, throughout that day and into the evening, officials at the Treasury, the FSA and the Bank of England nervously watched over RBS.
It was a tremendous struggle, hour by hour, to keep enough funding coming in.
We only really knew by probably about 7 o'clock at night that everyone was going to get through to the next day.
Disaster had been averted, but only till the markets opened the next morning. The team at the Treasury would not leave that night.
It would have been nice to announce every last detail of the plan. I had to announce the first thing on the Wednesday morning, in principle, this is what the British government intends to do.
They'd announce all big UK banks would increase their capital. For HBOS and RBS, that meant nationalisation. Time to call in the bankers.
It was strange. It seemed like everyone knew that they were going to be expected at the Treasury that night, because people were rung and 5 minutes later they were popping in through the door. And I don't think they all live in Whitehall.
We got the banks in and told them what we were going to do, and I made it clear that there was no choice in the matter.
The initial reaction was, as you would expect, reasonably defensive. And the Chancellor was charming in his resolution that something would have to be agreed.
I said, this is what we're going to do. There's nothing else. You really have to just concentrate on that.
The banks that urgently needed government money were HBOS and RBS. But for the plan to work, all the big UK banks needed to agree to take part.
A message of the British banking system is resilient, it is strong, we, the government, will do whatever it takes to ensure that it can cope with the pressures being placed on it.
RBS boss Sir Fred Goodwin reportedly denied he needed government capital, claiming RBS just had a liquidity or cash flow shortage. I don't have a capital problem, I have a liquidity problem.
After it was said, the room went quite quiet for a while, and one of the other chief executives said, everyone knows it's your problem.
Sir Fred declined to be interviewed, but he said it is not true he did not understand there was a capital issue. He believed the immediate issue was liquidity. The bigger long-term issue was capital.
The RBS view was it didn't have a capital problem, whereas it most certainly did, and that's why we own 70% of it now.
Goodwin said he was particularly upset at the suggestion there was some dispute at the meeting.
I think one of the lessons that we need to draw from this is the first line of defence is having people sitting in a bank boardroom that understand what is going on in their own business.
Is this a new dawn for our troubled banks?
A dramatic morning, the final chapter of the
Chancellor, Alistair Darling, is due to give details.
The cameras were out early the next morning. Everybody knew this was a make-or-break moment for the country, possibly the world. The Bank of England quietly prepared to loan RBS and HBOS enough cash to keep them going to the end of the week. And the Chancellor and the Prime Minister prepared to announce their plan.
When Gordon and Alistair stood up and made the announcement on the Wednesday morning, for me was the scariest moment, because at that point we had no idea who was going to follow, no idea what the markets were going to think, no idea what the public was going to think, no idea if it would really boost confidence.
Problems that started in America, these are also global problems. Global action is required. This is a long haul, and we have invited other European countries to consider proposals we have put to them this morning. The day that we announced the recapitalisation of the British banking system, I was hoping that the rest of the world, at least the major countries in the world, would follow. We hadn't yet persuaded other countries that it was a necessary thing to do, so it was a very difficult day for us.
What we wanted to do here,
we were putting up £50 billion of taxpayers' money. Nobody had ever done that before. Nobody had ever talked in these sort of figures before. It could have been an initiative that went entirely wrong because no other country was prepared to support us.
For the plan to work, they needed America and Europe to sign up. Brown set off for Paris to convince the Eurozone countries, while Alistair Darling and Mervyn King went to Washington to sell it to a gathering of the International Monetary Fund and the G7's finance ministers.
this wasn't the normal IMF meetings, where you meet for a couple of days and you produce a 10-page communique and you all go home again.
There was, in my experience, for the first time at international meetings, a sense that the collective need outweighed the interests of any individual country.
One of the finance ministers in particular haunted the proceedings, a warning to the others of what fate awaited them if they failed. Iceland was bankrupt, a victim of its banks.
I don't think I've ever left Iceland with as much money as I did at that time, because I didn't know when I would be checking out of the hotel whether my credit card would be working at all.
Country after country resembled deer stuck in headlights. They were paralyzed.
Financial institutions, banks, bankers, traders were at a loss. And they were sort of not only holding out their hand, but also, turning to us to say, what are we going to do? We need help.
The UK Chancellor had a chance to have a word in the right ears.
I had a long conversation with Hank Paulson. He knew that, the same thing was happening in the United States. So I think there was a consciousness that this was a case where actually internationally you can make a difference.
It wasn't like the UK said capital injections, and we looked at that and said, oh boy, we never thought of that. Wow, it's going so well there. We never thought of it. We've better go do it. From the very beginning, it was one of the options.
Britain's audacious gambit to infuse banks with taxpayer money and guarantee loans put America in an impossible position. London now had a competitive advantage over its New York rival.
It certainly had an impact on what we're doing, because if the UK authorities were going to do a broad equity investment in their banks, and probably more importantly do a broad liability guarantee from the government, that would have a very profound impact on the U.S. banking institutions.
Today's actions are not what we ever wanted to do, but today's actions are what we must do to restore confidence in our financial system. Today, I am announcing that the Treasury will purchase equity stakes in a wide variety of banks and thrifts.
The UK had maneuvered America into following its plan. The US diverted the money allocated for buying toxic assets and instead bought shares in its banks and set up a scheme to guarantee bank loans. The Eurozone states did the same.
Those two, the capital injections and the loan guarantees, were really the keys to stabilizing the financial system.
It was very effective because this was the clearest indication that we could make that the government was going to stand behind the big institutions in the U.S.
In the weeks afterwards, matters clearly improved and the panic was over. Of course, it did not mean that the problems were over.
Had we not had that British announcement, we may be in a very different place today, a much worse place today.
By the end of the year, policymakers were confident the cash machines would stay open. But even that could not prevent the first Great Recession in the age of globalization. In Britain, 750,000 jobs have gone in the last year alone. The recession has touched almost every country.
I don't think there is anything comparable to that unless you go back to 1914 or the 19th century, and I think the global consequences there were probably less than we saw last autumn.
I think the fault lies with the rich countries. Why? Because they believed for decades the market by itself could resolve all problems. So when the market proved to be fragile, incompetent, then the state started to see that they had to act, and act decisively.
Levels, the stock of national debt is going to keep on rising.
For a £175 billion budget deficit this year.
Unprecedented levels of debt, tax increases and a squeeze on public spending.
The crash was decades in the making. The final cost will not be known for years. Since the collapse of Lehman Brothers, governments have spent or pledged at least $6 trillion to fight the crisis. The Treasury says UK national debt could rise by 20% to around £1 trillion in 5 years, equivalent to £16,000 per person. However, its investment in the banks could eventually turn a profit.
Even right up until September, most of these big banks basically are pretty disdainful of government. What's blindingly obvious is there are certainly global institutions when things are going well, but they become very, very local when things go badly. And then, here they are turning up at the front door of the Treasury saying, could you help, please?
The world's 20 biggest economies all now profess the need for stricter regulation. But in the 4 times they've met since the fall of Lehman, reaching consensus has been difficult.
If we wait until after the fact, the appetite for better and appropriate regulation will be gone. And everybody will be back to business as usual, and we run the risk of our taxpayers saying, well, we're paying all this money, but what's in it for us at the end of the day? Aren't you promising a better world?
The Lehman collapse shattered assumptions built up over decades. That modern finance eliminated risk. That asset prices would only rise, and the market operates best when left alone. And perhaps biggest of all, the collapse of Lehman shattered the illusion that we can ignore history.
There's no new paradigm here at all. This is something we've seen on many occasions over several hundred years. But the fact that we've seen it in the past and not been able to improve things is a worry. This is one of a long series of financial crises. It's been the biggest one, perhaps, ever, but it's come out of almost the same sort of problems that we've seen in the past. People who think the world has changed, I'm afraid, have not read history.
From the South Sea bubble to the dot-com boom, from 1929 to 2008, every crash is a story of its time. But they have all shared a common theme. A reckless love of money.
And if you've missed any of the series, you can catch up with the BBC iPlayer. On the way next on BBC Two, Lightening the Mood with Mock the Week.